Chapter 6. Children poured into the white zone seconds later, having clearly been given permission to escape whatever it was they'd been corralled into the den for. Judd wasn't the least surprised when they made a beeline for the adults. Big playmates to climb over were always welcome. Hawk! Hawk! Brown-eyed, silky-haired Ben tugged on his alpha's hand as the lieutenants who'd attended the meeting remotely signed off with goodbyes that held smiles. Are we really gonna have a party with Julian and Roman and Keenan and everyone? That explained the excitement in the air. Judd thought as he reached down to pick up a little girl who was too small to push through the pack of pups. Putting her on his shoulders, he held her gently in place with one hand rather than with telekinesis. Children this young sometimes got scared when they couldn't feel his hand. She laughed and kicked feet clad in sparkling blue sandals. Before living in the pack, Judd would have never understood why changeling parents spent time and money on dressing their children when those children could shift without warning at any minute, destroying the items. Now no one had to explain it to him. Judd had given Ben the superhero t-shirt he currently wore. The 6-going-on-6.5-year-old was jumping up and down at Hawk's positive reply. Will we get to play games? And climb trees? Ben was one of the few wolves who could really climb even in his wolf form. All thanks to his leopard playmates. Julian and Roman might be a year younger, but they were as prone to getting into mischief as Ben. The last time the three had been together, when Tamsin came up to consult with Laura, they'd somehow managed to get into a supplies cupboard and gorge on the fancy chocolate the maternal females had been saving for dessert after a planned working dinner. The chocolate-smeared miscreants had been found snoring away in the cupboard. I don't think it would be a party without play, Hawk answered with a grin before he hitched Ben onto his back, where the little boy clung like a monkey. I don't know about climbing though. I like the earth under my paws. It's fun, Ben insisted, the chorus repeated by other children nearby. Have you been contaminating your packmates with leopard ways? Indigo asked darkly, though her eyes were dancing. No, Ben said then frowned. What does contaminating mean? Laughing, Indigo clapped her hands. Who wants to play tag? Hawk is it? Yay! The sound wave of agreement shook the trees before the kids scattered. Ben scrambling down to run away as fast as his little legs would carry him. A slightly older group of kids, meanwhile, was huddled in another corner of the white zone. As a grinning Rias jogged past them to the den to safely stow the mobile comm, Judd managed to see between the children's bodies, realized they were filling colorful water balloons from large bottles of water they'd smuggled out. In front of Judd, Hawk narrowed his eyes at Indigo. Right, I know who's next. The lieutenant took off without a backward glance, weaving between delighted children while Drew got in Hawk's way. Can't let you tag my mate, the tracker said, hands open, palms out on either side of his body. Having lowered the little girl he'd been holding so she could toddle away to hide, Judd used his telekinetic abilities to move Drew out of the way. Hey! His brother-in-law scowled at him as Hawk took off after Indigo, their alpha pretending to growl and go after several small children along the way, who all ran off squealing. Sienna, meanwhile, was laughingly trying to herd Indigo into a trap, with a returned Rias's help. What the hell was that for? Drew snarled, his shoulders moving fluidly under a dark blue tee with a silver design on one side as he threw up his hands. Remember that time we played war games and you almost broke my ribs? It had been before Judd and Brenna's mating, at a time when Drew was certain Judd was no good for his baby sister. I decided I'm still holding a grudge. You got your own back. Drew's response was half wolf, his claws sliding out of his skin. You almost dislocated my shoulder that day. Judd pretended to think about it. I did, didn't I? Having telekinetically stolen a water balloon from the enterprising group in the corner, he said. So maybe I just wanted you here so I could do this. And threw the balloon at Drew. Caught the wolf in the face. Growling as water dripped from his face onto his chest, Drew body slammed Judd, and they went down. At which point, the other man clawed up dirt and grass and stuffed the mass down Judd's back. Judd attempted to flip his brother-in-law off him, was foiled when pups drawn by their commotion ran over. Here, Drew, one said, holding out a bright pink water balloon. Drew bared his teeth and smashed the balloon right on Judd's neck, which meant the water went down his back and chest, turning the dirt to mud. Oops. Fighting dirty now, Judd got him with a couple more balloons. This time they were supplied eagerly by the children. Then he got lucky and managed to rub dirt onto Drew's face. The pups, young and old, loved this new game. Mud was soon being rubbed onto both Drew and Judd with enthusiastic little hands, while the pups laughed like little demons. Judd, sitting up now with Drew behind him back to back, felt something build inside his chest. Your fault, Drew growled. Remind me to wring your neck. Noted. That powerful feeling kept building and building. And then a pup stopped squishing mud into Judd's hair to peer at him with big blue eyes. Uncle Judd's laughing. He realized. Quietly, shoulders shaking. But the laughter, it wouldn't stay inside. Drew elbowed him from the back. Not funny, man. I had on a new t-shirt. Judd just laughed harder, until Drew gave in and began to chuckle too. Judd's stomach was aching when he looked up and saw a beautiful blonde snow dancer step into the carnage of the white zone. His mate was dressed in sleek gray pants cropped at mid-calf, her formal white shirt tucked into the pants. Colorful orange flats rounded out the professional look. Her hair, which she'd grown out, was twisted into a complicated knot at the back of her head, her side-swept bangs providing a frame for her fine-boned face. I see, she said, coming to stand over him, and Drew fisted hands on her hips. While I'm off having serious meetings at the university, you all get to play. Her attempt to sound stern was totally defused by the sparkle in brown eyes shattered by spikes of Arctic blue that speared out from midnight pupils. Those extraordinary eyes were all that remained of her trauma at a monster's hands, and she'd made them her own. The vicious serial killer who'd taken and tortured Brenna had wanted to mark her, break her, then end her life. But he was the one who was dead. Brenna had survived, grown strong, reclaimed every part of herself. And the monster? She'd banished him from her mind until he couldn't even stalk her nightmares. People called Judd tough. He had nothing on Brenna Shane Kincaid. Want to join us? He held up a muddy hand while Drew said, Yeah, Bren. Come play. His voice was suspiciously cheerful. Raising her hands and clearly realizing both her brother and her mate were up to no good, Brenna backed off. I love you both, but no. Not when I'm wearing these clothes. She was gorgeous and so incredibly smart, Judd's mate. She was also in the middle of the white zone with kids who'd figured out the adults were in the mood to play. The first water balloon hit her 10 seconds later, catching her on the back. Her yelp of surprise was followed by a second balloon that soaked her front, revealing the lines of the simple white bra Judd had watched her put on this morning. He loved watching her dress, loved the way she moved about so energetic and chatty in the morning, and he loved that she fed his touch hunger with demands of her own. Judd liked nothing better than to get his hands on her. Since you're wet anyway. Rolling to his feet, he started to stalk toward her. You keep your distance, Brenna ordered. Judd Lauren, I mean it. I am not getting mud all over. Giving up trying to make him behave when it was clear he wasn't about to listen, she took off into the trees, kicking off her flats along the way. Judd went to race after her, only to be brought down hard by a grip on his ankle. All the air in his lungs exploded from his mouth as he went chest down right into the spot the pups had made their impromptu mud creation zone. When he looked back, it was to see a certain blue-eyed wolf smirking at him. Remember that time you used telekinesis on me? Drew said. I decided I'm still holding a grudge. Judd took a breath, then unstuck himself from the mud by pushing up onto his hands. Drew tightened his grip. And Judd took a leaf from Ben's Book of Mischief. The pup was a master at innocent misdirection. Judd's misdirection wasn't so innocent. Indigo's on the ground, he said after pretending to look to the other end of the white zone. I think Hawk's making her eat grass. Drew's hold grew slack as his head snapped in the direction Judd had been looking. What? It was a growl. Where? Breaking free before the tracker could figure out Judd was lying through his teeth, Judd followed his mate's scent into the forest beyond the clearing of the white zone. She'd made good use of her head start, but while she was a wolf, he was an arrow. He was also teleport capable. He didn't cheat though, staying on foot and using only the tracking skills he'd learned since becoming a real part of Snowdancer, rather than simply existing within the pack. When he caught Brenna, it was because she'd paused to take a rest by a large, deep pond. It had a mirror-like surface kissed by sunlight and surrounded by purple blooms with yellow hearts, as well as by tiny white wildflowers that reminded him of daisies, the mountain flora having adapted to survive at this altitude. Careful to stay upwind so she wouldn't catch his scent, he crept up behind her. Judd! She screamed as he wrapped his arms around her and rubbed his muddy face against the side of hers, his equally muddy chest sticking to the back of her wet shirt. He wasn't expecting her to hook her foot around his legs, unbalance him. They fell into the pond together, came up spluttering. Splashing water at him, Brenna grinned. Serves you right. I needed to wash off the mud anyway. Going under, he scrubbed his face clean before coming back up and hauling her close with one arm around her waist. Her body was softly curved and lithely muscled both. Brenna was a tech rather than a soldier, but aside from her lupin love of running under the moonlight, she attended certain compulsory training sessions alongside fellow packmates who weren't submissive, but who weren't dominant enough that a protective security role in the pack was a driving force. They had the combat training so they could provide backup should Snowdancer suffer an assault that broke through the ranks of aggressive dominance. The training was intense and regular, and it satisfied the dominance of the wolf within while permitting Brenna to continue to work in another field. Because her true asset was her dazzling mind. How was the meeting? Good. The university wants me to teach a class. Judd felt no surprise. Young though she was, Brenna was at the forefront of her field, her ideas cutting edge. You want to? I'm considering it. Mind clearly on other matters, she smiled and wrapped her legs around his waist, having already linked her arms loosely around his neck. Do you think we're far enough away from the white zone not to be interrupted? He knew that tone in her voice, slightly husky and soft at the same time. His body responded as if it had been conditioned. Unlike the brutal suffocation of silence, however, this conditioning was chosen, was wanted. Gripping her lush lower curves, he opened to the kiss she claimed, felt his erection harden further as she licked her tongue against his. His hands flexed on her. His body hers to command. His mate had taught him pleasure after a lifetime of cold discipline engendered by torture that had forever ended his childhood. And now he craved that pleasure. Craved her. Only with Brenna could he be this man. A man who demanded and gave and who sank into sensation. Sliding one hand up her back, he was about to deepen the kiss when he heard voices, felt the thunder of pounding feet. He broke the kiss just in time to witness an invasion, as all the adults who'd been in the white zone jumped into the pond en masse, most with loud whooping and hard splashes. Brenna threw back her head and laughed as she was splashed, broke free to splash back. Judd watched her grin, watched her sparkle. And he played. It was no longer a foreign experience. As he stole a kiss from his mate a few minutes later, he hoped his friend Xavier would have the same chance at happiness, that he'd find his Nina. Of the three of them who had come together to form their own small rebel cell, Judd, Caleb, Xavier, the priest was undeniably the only one who was good to the core of his soul. He might have struggled, might have looked into the screaming depths of the abyss, but Xavier Perez had never fallen into that darkness. He deserved joy, deserved to find the love he'd lost under a hail of bloody telepathic strikes over 9 years earlier. Good luck, my friend. Letters to Nina. From the private diaries of Father Xavier Perez. July 8, 2073. Nina. I'm sitting surrounded by the phantom image of what was once our village. A bare 3 months since the Psi attack and there's nothing here anymore. The bodies are all gone, as are the houses. No sign remains of the vibrant place that was our home. I can hear you laughing at the idea of me writing a letter. I never did write you romantic love notes like Jorge did to Fiorella, even after you hinted so hard you may as well have hit me over the head with a hammer. Why should I write letters, I thought, when my Nina is here beside me, and I can love her with my voice, my hands, my body. But now I've lost you and all I have left is paper and ink. I saw you go over the cliff into the river. I made you jump. I thought you'd be safe, that the waters would carry you away from the carnage. The silence here is ugly, obscene. A heavy shroud. In the months since the Psi murdered all those we loved, I've returned here many times hoping you'd made your way back, but I've found no trace of you. No one knows of a woman who came out of the river. No one has heard of my Nina. I'm not giving up. I'll never give up. Because from the day I first grew old enough to remember my own thoughts, I knew 2 things. That I was a man of God and that one day I would marry you. I'll find you, Nina. No matter what it takes or how long I have to search. I'll find you. Your Xavier. Chapter 7. Caleb hadn't been serious when he told Judd he was thinking of taking Silver along to the meeting with Aina Merchant, but when his most senior aide walked into his office as he was buttoning up the jacket of his navy blue pinstriped suit, he considered it for an instant, because the Merchants were unusual. In political terms and in terms of their intelligence network, their importance was far-reaching. Most people saw them as shadow players who wanted to manipulate puppets in positions of power, but Caleb had always seen something different. A family that had stayed a family regardless of silence. They were a tightly integrated unit with blood-deep loyalty to one another. Caleb had first hired Silver because he wanted an in with the Merchants, had kept her on even after he figured out that getting Merchant trust was nothing so simple. It had been an easy decision. Silver was the best aide he'd ever had, one who worked efficiently with and for him, as evidenced by the fact that she was here so early this morning. However, Silver also had the critical capacity to make independent decisions, and take the necessary steps to action those decisions. Caleb didn't trust her. He trusted very few people, but he had long ago decided that whether she brought the Merchant family with her, or not, Silver had considerable value on her own. She proved that value with her next question. Sir, she said, would you like me to accompany you to this meeting? No, he answered, at the same time setting up a psychic filter for any mentions of Lucas Hunter's child. It would run quietly in the background so long as he didn't turn it off. I think your grandmother and I should speak alone. Silver's expression didn't change. She was always coolly composed, no matter the pressure, her ice-blonde hair pinned neatly back in a sophisticated roll and her body clad in skirt suits paired with spike heels. Today's suit was gray, the shirt white. The heels were black. Caleb only noticed things like that because he saw them as tools. Silver was far too intelligent to dress in impractical heels unless they gave her an advantage in some way. "If I might make a suggestion," she said now. Caleb nodded. He was well aware of his own strength and power, but arrogance was a flaw he tried not to cultivate. It led only to bitter outcomes. Look at Ming Leben, scrambling to make a place for himself in the world after losing his grip on the most lethal squad of assassins ever known. Had Ming still had the loyalty of the arrows, he'd have held more power than even Caleb. But where Caleb had Sahara to keep him anchored, to keep him as honest as he could ever be, Ming had no one he could truly trust. It was difficult to build that trust when subordinates lived in constant fear of death or torture, because Ming didn't tolerate mistakes. Caleb didn't either, but he didn't punish mistakes that were genuine, or those that had been made in pursuit of a worthwhile goal. He'd been known to promote not only the winners, but also those who had failed but then dusted themselves off and tried again. To do otherwise was to stifle all innovation and drive. Most of all, his people knew he never forgot those who'd been loyal. As he hadn't forgotten Silver when it came time to promote someone to coordinate the worldwide emergency response network. Yes, Sahara had had to nudge him, but only because he didn't want to lose part of Silver's attention to Amidst, not because he didn't have confidence in her competence for the task. "Grandmother Merchant is predisposed to work with you," Silver said as those thoughts passed rapidly through his head. "Don't insult her intelligence at any point by lying or skirting the truth, and you'll come out of the meeting with everything you want." Caleb held Silver's eyes, the color an unusual light shade that was a marker of one branch of the Merchant family tree. Her brother had the same eyes, as did her mother and grandmother. "Understood," he said. "I'm surprised you're offering me advice that might help me best your own grandmother." "It's not about besting," Silver replied. "It's about ensuring you don't make a mistake that will cost both parties in the long run." Caleb understood the subtext. The Merchants had, for whatever reason, decided to welcome him into the fold. All he had to do was accept that welcome and work with them. "Thank you, Silver." Inclining her head, she passed over a whisper-thin organizer that was a prototype from one of Caleb's enterprises. "If you could sign this contract before you go." Caleb scanned the text to make sure it was exactly as he wanted it, then signed. "No interruptions unless it's an emergency." "Yes, sir." Having already gotten a fix on the visual coordinates he'd been given, Caleb teleported to the location of the meeting, though he could have teleported directly to Aina Merchant. Despite her tendency to stay out of the spotlight, he had a recent visual of her face. Not all teleporters could lock on to people as well as places, but Caleb had been born with the ability. Using it in these circumstances, however, would have been a grave insult to his host. "I couldn't resist," whispered a familiar telepathic voice, carried along their bond and augmented by Caleb's own strength until Sahara could reach him telepathically, no matter the distance that separated them. "What does Aina Merchant's inner sanctum look like?" The darkness inside Caleb stretched out under the light that was Sahara. "Are you still in bed?" He'd left her warm and sleepy and flushed from his kiss when he teleported into the office. "Do you know how sexy you are when you dress in those suits?" was her response. "Especially when you button up your shirt, then slot in the cufflinks. Watching you is like having a waking erotic dream." Caleb smiled inwardly. "Yes, I know." Sahara had made it clear by the way she watched him, by the number of times she'd hauled him into bed after he'd had his shower and was dressing. "Should I stop? Come home and tease me after this meeting. You left too early." His inward smile deepened even as he kept his face expressionless. "I have an empire to run." "What's another million or 5 when you have? I don't even know how much money you have." "A lot. And it's ours, not mine." He built the empire for her, built everything for her. "This location in Aina Merchant's home is identical to the image I showed you. A cool floor of dark stone, steel gray walls, sofas of a darker gray." "Really?" A hint of disappointment. "I expected something unexpected. She's the Merchant after all." Caleb looked around the room, spotted what he'd missed when he first came in. There's a vase of dark red roses along one wall. A single violent splash of color in the gray. Perhaps a subtle reminder that those who cross the Merchants die bloody deaths? "Don't joke," Sahara ordered, her tone no longer playful. "These people are dangerous." "So am I," he reminded the woman who worried about him, who loved him, twisted internal scars and all. "But I promise I won't take anything for granted. The Merchants can be lethal foes." He walked to the large sloping windows that looked out over a misty gorge. It was heading into night in this part of the world, but Aina's windows didn't look out over a city bright with sparkling lights. No, beyond the gorge was craggy rock and then the crashing sea. This is interesting. He sent Sahara an image of what he was seeing. His senses alerted him to another presence at almost the same instant. Turning, he saw a woman who was silver with 50 more years of life. The same eyes, the same sharply defined face. The difference was that Aina Merkin's hair was silky white and she wore not a skirt suit, but pants that moved fluidly around her legs. The color of the fabric similar to that of the Café au lait Sahara had made Caleb try 3 days earlier. Aina's top was the same color and of the same fabric and flowed to her hips while covering her arms. On her feet were black flats. She also wore a long silver necklace that came down to below her breasts, and was anchored by an ornate metal pendant with a core of red. Sai rarely wore jewelry, but Caleb had a feeling this wasn't just jewelry. Aina, he said, very deliberately using her first name. Aina Merkant might be a shadow power, but Caleb was a power. Better she not forget that. His decision wasn't arrogance but the cool tactical thinking that had led to his meteoric rise. And that kept him at the top of the food chain. Even Pax Marshall, who was flexing his muscle against many others, gave Caleb a wide berth. Caleb. Aina Merkant's voice had a rasp that seemed natural. What do you think of the view? Turning back to it as she came to stand beside him, he said, It's similar to my own view at home. His deck jutted out over a gorge as steep. You don't want to be closer to a metropolitan area? That was the choice made by most Sai. Do you? Aina's eyes remained on the foaming waves in the distance. No, but I'm a teleporter. A graceful incline of Aina's head. Point well made. She moved her hand. Come sit, let's talk. Caleb left the meeting 2 hours later with the understanding that the Merkants were in his corner, and that Aina Merkant might be the most dangerous individual he'd ever met. She had ruthless intelligence paired with ruthless ambition, but where others use such ambition for themselves, Aina used it in pursuit of power for her family. We've accepted you as one of us, Aina had said to him point blank. Don't betray the family and we will never betray you. It was a far better outcome than Caleb could have ever anticipated. I won't be like the rest of your family, Aina, he'd pointed out. The only orders I take are my own. And Sahara's. But Aina Merkant didn't need to know that. The older Sai had given him a look that betrayed nothing. But that wasn't as closed as her expression had been at the start of their meeting. I'm well aware we're welcoming a predator into our midst, Caleb. But never forget that even predators can be taken down by a single poison dart. He'd smiled. So we understand each other. Two predators who had decided to cooperate and to watch one another's backs. Yes. Aina had raised the delicate bone china teacup in her hand, full of a pale green liquid that wasn't part of the ordinary Sai nutrition list. Welcome to the family. Having teleported back to his office rather than to Sahara because she'd had to go into a meeting herself 20 minutes earlier, Caleb kept the door shut and considered the implications of the day. Merkant help was not to be taken lightly and Caleb had no intention of abusing their trust. He was a man who knew how to value his assets and the Merkant intelligence network alone held the power to topple countless individuals. Ping. The psychic alert was faint and part of the myriad pieces of data flowing into his mind at any one instant, but he took a second to glance at it. Interesting. His search had picked up a mention of the DarkRiver Alpha's child. Stepping out into the Cynet with his mind cloaked so well that he was a ghost, he shot himself to the exact location of the ping. Around him, the Cynet was a vast blackness populated with millions of stars that represented the minds of the Sai in the net. But where there had been only black and white, there was now a delicate golden framework underlying everything. The honeycomb created by the empaths, the fragile golden structure that kept the net from crumbling. Brilliant in the once pure black spaces in between the bonds of the honeycomb were the sparks of color that denoted a psychic network awash in empaths. Research suggested the reason those sparks were so prevalent was because the Cynet was sick, needed a lot of healing. Today, however, his attention was not on those sparks or on the fine golden lines that connected people to the ES and the ES to one another. It was on the data that flowed constantly through the empty spaces between minds, endless streams of it. He was only interested in a particular piece of it. Sai with shifting powers? Catching the first hint of the conversation that had prompted the alert, he came to a halt, listened. Such an individual would have enviable abilities. Do you truly believe so? Don't forget, the child will be hampered by her animalistic instincts. The changelings have proven intelligent. Yes, but Sai are more intelligent. Nadia Hunter is unlikely to have the same brain power. Caleb didn't need to listen any longer. It took less than a minute to identify the minds as belonging to would-be intellectuals from a university. Like many academics, their shields were all but useless. Inserting a complex reporter bug in each mind, one that would awaken if and only should the mind involved begin thinking about the child in a way that indicated danger to her, he left them to their pontificating. He returned to his own mind with the awareness that a large cross-section of the psi race still couldn't see outside their bubble of perceived superiority. Fools. Those who thrive post-silence would be the ones who knew the truth, knew that their competitors had the same hard-nosed intelligence and capacity to innovate. In the case of humans, they often had more because of the way they had so long been sidelined or abused. Mention of the child, he messaged Judd. No threat. Intellectual curiosity. More like speaking simply to hear their own voices. The reply was prompt. Let's hope they keep it to that. Yes, Caleb thought, highly conscious of what Nadia Naya Hunter represented. Considering the bloodshed that would erupt should she be harmed, he decided to use the net mind and dark mind to heighten the watch. The net mind was the librarian and guardian of the net, its task to create order out of a chaos of data and minds. The dark mind was far different, a twisted and homicidal creature. Caleb could speak to both, understand both. Yin and yang, dark and light, innocence and horror. When the twin sentients came to him, however, they were disturbed. Or the net mind was disturbed and the dark mind was ambivalent. Following them back into the net, Caleb found himself being taken to a section that was dark. Dead.
No empathic sparks.
No minds within the dead section.
No honeycomb strands.
That wasn't unusual. Parts of the net had suffered catastrophic damage before the empaths woke and began to sew it back together. At the current rate of improvement, it would take years, an entire generation, maybe two, for those sections to recover. No minds could anchor there until then. Nothing would survive, or if it did, it would be a creature of raving insanity. Following the net mind's wordless urgings, he shifted his point of view and saw the problem. The rot, the disease was spreading. Not, however, in a way most people would be able to detect. No, the fine threads of the net were literally coming apart strand by strand below the surface. Caleb only saw it because the net mind had imposed its vision over his. Did you show the empaths? A sense of the negative, of an awareness the ES were already close to exhaustion. Caleb couldn't disagree. Sahara worked closely with the empathic collective, and she'd been sharing her worry with him that designation he was being asked to take on too much too soon. No one designation can shoulder that much responsibility, she'd said, eyes of darkest blue passionate. It's getting impossible to juggle the workload. I'm terrified that despite our best efforts not to repeat the mistakes of the past, they'll begin to crumple under the pressure. The problem was that no one else could do what the ES could. Now it appeared even their efforts hadn't totally stopped the insidious disintegration of the psychic fabric of the Psynet. They'd given the Psynet a fighting chance, but it was struggling not to fray apart. Yet, despite his first thoughts, this didn't feel like a resurgence of the disease. Rather, it seemed an indication of a deeper issue. A structural weakness that had permitted the disease to take hold in the first place. Is it because there aren't enough ES at this location? He asked the netmind, because if that was the case, the ES could rearrange themselves to fix the damage before it became critical. The netmind sent him a sense of the negative. The dark mind, meanwhile, swam into the dead space, becoming at one with it. The two were created of the same primordial soup. All the rage, anger, jealousy, and other dark emotions the Psi race had refused to feel for so long. Only it hadn't ever disappeared. It had simply collected in dark pockets of the psychic network, until it split the netmind into a stable innocence and a murderous darkness. Today, neither half could tell him why the Psynet was breaking apart, filament by filament, even as the honeycomb fought to hold it together, even as the sparks of color that were the emanations of the ES spread through the black night of the spaces between minds. The Psynet should have been healing. Instead, it was simply dying more. Chapter 8. Sasha hung up after a troubling conversation with Ivy Jane. Her fellow E and president of the Empathic Collective had called to discuss the information she just received from Caleb Krychek. Coming on top of the possible threat to Naya that Lucas had warned Sasha about earlier that day, it left her worried on multiple levels. Naya was her first priority and always would be, but there were tens of thousands of children in the Psynet too. Even if the honeycomb meant the Psynet wouldn't collapse on them as it had done in sections prior to the awakening of the ES, the disintegration and hidden weakness within had to be having an impact on all those developing young minds. It frustrated her that she hadn't been able to give Ivy any answers. Part of it was because she'd been out of the Psynet since her defection and was receiving all data secondhand, but mostly it was because they were all stumbling in the dark. No one knew the exact extent of the damage done by 100 years of forced conditioning, of erasing emotion. Coming, she said when Naya made a questioning noise from the living room. It would have sounded like "Demi" to most people. Sasha knew her daughter was asking after her milk. Setting aside the issues preying on her mind for now, Naya was far too good at picking up emotional nuances. Sasha breathed deep to calm herself. On its way, sweetheart. She just brought out the milk to warm it on a low setting on the cooker when Ivy called. Naya liked it when Sasha made her milk that way, especially if she dusted it with a little dark chocolate. Her mother's daughter, Lucas said with a sinful grin each time he saw Sasha sprinkling chocolate onto Naya's milk. Not a lot. Never enough to harm their baby's health. Just the tiniest taste to make this a sometimes treat now that Naya was almost 1 and starting to become more adventurous with her food choices. The milk would hold Naya over until Lucas arrived home, and they could have dinner together. Changelings tried to have meals together with their cubs whenever possible. Naya's mind touched hers right then, sending her hungry thoughts. Sasha's lips tugged up at the corners, all stress suddenly melting away. I know you're not starving, Munchkin, she said, layering her response with emotion so Naya would understand her meaning. Her and Lucas's baby was smart, but she was still a baby. Guilty giggles sounded from the living area. Even as her smile deepened, Sasha told herself to be firm. It was extremely difficult when Naya was smart enough to know she could get out of trouble by being adorable, and when Sasha was terrified of ever hurting her baby's heart as her own had been hurt when she'd been a vulnerable child. Consciously, she understood that gentle correction was nothing like the harsh lessons she'd been taught as a child, but it took real effort of will for her to put that into practice. Every time she began to backslide into being too permissive, she reminded herself that Naya was a happy, settled child who knew she was deeply loved. She asked for affection whenever she needed it, with zero expectation that she might be refused or rejected. That idea was simply not part of her worldview, exactly as Sasha wanted for her. She was also secure enough to be naughty. Lucas had to chase Naya around the area at bedtime last night. Her walk might still be a little shaky, but she was a rocket when it came to crawling. Dressed only in a diaper, she'd laughed uproariously and said a loud firm no each time Lucas caught her and put her in her crib. After which she'd clamber out. She'd figured out how to escape a month earlier, and the game would begin again. Of course, since Lucas was a cat, he'd been having just as much fun as their daughter. Sasha, meanwhile, had sat in the living room with a cup of hot chocolate and just indulged in the sight of her mate playing with their cub. She'd had to pretend to be stern when Naya ran over and pleaded her case with loud sounds and wild gesticulations of her hands. No, Naya, she'd said, biting her tongue in an effort not to laugh. It's time for bed. Go with Papa. At which point, Naya had growled at her, eyes sparkling with mischief. And Sasha had cracked, laughing so hard she'd had to put down her hot chocolate before she spilled it. Lucas had shaken his head as Naya plopped down on her diaper-covered butt and joined in, clapping her hands at having made her mommy laugh.
No discipline.
Lucas had mock-growled at her before picking up their misbehaving baby. And you? A growly nuzzle that made Naya laugh harder and pat his stubbled cheek. Time for bed. He'd finally got her to sleep, by walking around with her pressed up against his bare chest. Today their cub was playing in the living area just outside the kitchen nook. Sasha had locked the airy door to ensure Naya wouldn't undo the latch and go out onto the balcony, and Lucas had child-proofed the entire main area of the airy, so Naya was free to roam as she liked. A lot of the time she practiced her walking skills, and no matter how often she fell down, she started back up again after a little break. Stubborn, determined baby. Peeking out from the kitchen, Sasha found her concentrating on stacking the colored alphabet blocks Faith and Vaughn had given her as a gift. Beside her sat a more than slightly ragged wolf plush toy. Okay. The toy that shall not be named. Hawk had given that to Naya when she was a newborn, and it remained her favorite snuggle toy, much to her father's despair. Though Lucas did enjoy it when Naya went leopard on the toy, growling and fighting with the wolf. Then he'd smile and say, "That's my girl." Laughing softly and making a note to steal the toy for a wash after Naya went to sleep one night this week, Sasha returned her attention to stirring the slowly warming milk. As she waited for it to reach optimum temperature, she picked up an organizer with her other hand to finish reading a note from Tamsin about the joint DarkRiver Snowdancer event she and Laura had proposed to celebrate the birth of Mercy and Riley's babies. The pup cubs would, after all, belong to both packs. It's a good excuse to acknowledge how deeply the two packs are now linked, the pack healer had written. I think we need to recognize that, start getting everyone used to the fact that with the birth of the pup cubs, we're going to truly become two independent parts of a much stronger whole. To her original message, Tamsin had added an update. Snowdancer has suggested Mercy take the lead on this. I can see their point. Sasha smiled. Lucas had decided on Mercy too, but had been waiting to hear back from the wolves, see if they'd insist on a more hands-on approach. It would aggravate him that he and the wolves, especially Hawk, were on so much the same wavelength. Grinning, she tapped back a message to Tamsin, thanking the healer for the update and saying she'd pass it on to Lucas when he returned to the Eyrie. She and her mate switched off with childcare duties during the times Naya was home, but they were never out of touch with each other or the pack. As Alpha, Lucas had the heaviest workload, but Sasha had carved out her own place in DarkRiver, was the main point of contact for multiple matters so he could be free to focus on the wider picture. She missed Naya when she was away from her, but changeling cubs thrived on social interaction with other packmates. As a result, Naya was often at nursery school or on playdates with friends. Conscious of the responsibilities that befell the alpha pair, their packmates were more than willing to take full charge of those playdates, but Sasha and Lucas took their turns as the hosts. Naya needed to see her parents just as much as any other cub. Pack was built on the bonds of family. Putting down the organizer as the milk heated to just a little hotter than the temperature Naya liked, she turned off the cooker and carefully poured the milk into a sippy cup. It would be the right temperature by the time she got it into Naya's impatient hands. She was just sprinkling on the dark chocolate, from her personal stash, courtesy of her mate, when she felt a ripple along the mating bond that connected her to the man who was her heart. She smiled and looked out at Naya. "Papa's almost home." Face lighting up, Naya ran to the door on wobbly legs. She banged her small palms against it while saying, "Papa, Papa." Her speech development and comprehension skills had kicked in closer to the psi timeline than the changeling one, the likely result of her having constant telepathic contact with her mother. Sasha screwed on the lid of the sippy cup before she walked out barefoot to pick up her daughter. Only when she had a firm hold did she unlock the door and open it to the early evening darkness. Lucas jumped up onto the balcony less than a minute later. He'd clearly run full tilt from where he usually parked his car overnight. Changelings took care not to ruin the environment in which they thrived, and if that meant a long run home, so be it. Lucas's t-shirt was stuck to his chest, that chest heaving. Given his fitness, he had to have run really fast. "Racing to beat your best time?" Sasha asked as Naya stretched out toward her father, a wriggling, excited armful. Lucas's grin was pure sin. His green eyes all panther right then. Smacking a kiss on Naya's cheek after taking her into his arms, he hauled Sasha close with a grip on the back of her neck and claimed her mouth in a distinctly adult kiss. Even after more than 3 years as his mate, Sasha's bones melted. Pressing her hands against his chest, his heart thumping strong and fast under her palms and the scent of sweat and man around her, she rose up on her tiptoes, only breaking the kiss when her lungs protested. "I'm glad you're home." She hadn't seen him since 6 that morning, when he'd had to leave for an international conference call held in the comm room of DarkRiver's Chinatown HQ. To do with the fragile new Trinity Accord, it had had too many participants for him to take the meeting on their home comm screen. Since Sasha had no external meetings of her own, she'd chosen to stay home with Naya, though they'd barely actually been at home. Aside from the afternoon play session, they'd gone out for an hour in the morning so Naya could play with Anu's toddler. The sweet-natured 2-year-old and Naya were fast friends. Sasha had taken the chance to have a coffee with Anu as the two of them watched their children play. She'd expected stories of juvenile shenanigans from the cheerful maternal female, Anu's task in the pack to monitor the emotional health of the 11 to 13-year-old group. But Anu had shocked her with the news that the children hadn't gotten up to any tricks over the past week. "The good behavior won't last," she predicted with faux solemnity, her prettily plump face set in suspicious lines. "They're just lulling us into a false sense of security. Then pounce." Sasha was thinking she had to share Anu's comment with Lucas when he nipped at her lower lip. "I'm glad to be home," he said. "It's been a hell of a day." Another kiss, this one hard and fast, before he looked at Naya again. "Why are you pulling Papa's hair?" Naya's smile was pure gleeful cat. Oh. Sasha tensed her stomach in an effort to fight her laughter. She knew that only encouraged their daughter. But God, it was hard. She had no idea how Tamsin did it with her twins, who, incidentally, had taught Naya the word oops as a way to respond when caught making trouble. She could only enunciate oh. But her meaning was clear. She also knew the names of the twins, though she couldn't say Roman and Julian yet, only Ro and July. Oh is right. Lucas growled at Naya. Naya growled back, the sound so adorable in their cub's pride in making it such a huge happy thing that, once again, Sasha just could not keep a straight face. Turning away to hide her tearing eyes and laughter so Naya wouldn't realize how easily she could cute her way out of trouble, she breathed deep. Only when she had herself under control did she turn and take Naya back into her arms. "Come on. Let's go have your milk so your papa can shower." Following at their backs, Lucas pulled the door closed and locked it again. It's safe to release the escape artist. Sasha loved carrying Naya. Loved feeling her warm weight. But she'd learned that leopard changeling cubs did best if they were allowed a certain independence from a young age. When Naya wanted a cuddle, she'd find her. So she stole another cheek kiss before putting Naya on the play mat on which her daughter had stacked her blocks. Then she watched her mate walk toward the shower. Her sigh was deep. It was unfair how good he looked in an old pair of jeans and a simple t-shirt. Glancing over his shoulder as he reached the safely folded and stowed screen they used to separate out the living and sleeping areas when they had guests, Lucas grinned. Hold that thought until our princess is asleep. Sasha kept her gaze locked to that of her wild panther. Let the cat know she saw it prowling under his skin. Oh, I intend to. A chuckle before he went the rest of the way to the shower located off the bedroom area. Going into the kitchenette, Sasha picked up the sippy cup and brought it out to Naya. There you go, baby girl. Naya held the childproof cup with firm hands, little fingers around the handles on either side. Her eyes widened when she took the first sip out of the raised bit designed to ensure the milk wouldn't spill should it fall from her hands. Joe. Yes, chocolate. You were very good at news. I thought you deserved a treat. Rising to her feet, she went into the kitchenette to finish dinner preparations. Naya's meal was easy. When Sasha dropped off the twins this afternoon, Tamsin had given her a fresh jar of toddler-appropriate stew that Naya loved. If only adult food were so straightforward. Right, she said, and continued what she'd been doing before stopping to make Naya's milk. She was still a terrible cook overall, but she'd learned to make a few things that were fail-safe, and since Lucas had made sure they were fed 3 days running, it was only fair she take a turn. However, not only were her skills as a cook dismal, she had nothing on how sexy Lucas looked while cooking, especially since he had a tendency to walk around the area wearing only his jeans, those jeans hanging precariously low. Sighing again at the memory, then grinning because he'd probably come out of the shower with nothing but a towel hitched around his hips, she put the potato cheese bake she'd already prepared into the oven. Her plan was to pair it with the chicken she'd put in to roast prior to the troubling call from Ivy Jane. She crossed her fingers that the chicken wouldn't burn or be undercooked. It remained her nemesis, along with 1,000 other things. Picking up the organizer, she walked into the living room. She'd watch over Naya while Lucas showered, then put away work for the day. But first she had to reply to a eep. She jumped at the feel of something biting her ankle, glancing down just in time to see a furry black head disappear back under the small pink play table next to her. Eyes wide, Sasha tiptoed closer, was about to look beneath the table when she felt a deep need to do this with her mate by her side. Lucas, she whispered, reaching for him through the mating bond. The shower shut off a heartbeat later, and then a dripping Lucas, white towel wrapped around his hips exactly as she'd imagined, was walking out. What's the matter? Sasha just pointed to the table and waved him down onto his knees. Awareness dawning in eyes that rapidly went from human to panther. He came down beside her. Then together, they both pressed their weight onto their palms and looked under the table Naya liked to use to put her toys on when she was tidying. Bright green leopard eyes glowed at them before a tiny panther cub bounded out into their arms, or tried to. She wasn't very coordinated, more slid across the floor than ran. Pride burned in her eyes, in her mental presence, in her growling. Lucas growled back, chuckling and rubbing Naya's little head when she tried to pounce on him. Her concentration that of the very young child she was. She then turned to Sasha and tried to climb into her lap, Sasha having sat up on her knees. Sasha's heart had burst open at first sight of her child's new form. Jet black like her father except for those bright green eyes. Her leopard rosettes hidden in the black. Naya was astonishingly beautiful. Fighting happy tears, she said. Clever, clever girl. She'd been told changeling children shifted around 1 year of age, and with Naya's birthday a bare week away, Sasha had been watchful, but she thought she would feel a mental change when Naya shifted for the first time. Why didn't I feel you shift? Because it's normal for her. Lucas turned over onto his back on the play mat, uncaring of his wet state. Taking the silent invitation, Naya immediately ran over to climb laboriously onto his chest. She had to rest afterward, her tiny body heaving up and down under Lucas's hand. Once recovered, she stood on his chest and tried to bat playfully at his face. He deflected her with gentle hands, but in a way that told Naya it was all right to continue this game. She's always Naya, whatever form she takes. But when you shift, you feel wilder. Sasha didn't know how else to explain it. She's a baby, closer to her primal state. Naya looked up and purred when Sasha petted her, then fell flat on her belly, legs splayed out. Sasha helped her get back on her feet, where she once again started to fight with her father, safe in the knowledge that Lucas could easily handle her mock attack.
No close.
Lucas caught one small paw and tapped on the claws. When Naya made mewling sounds, claws still out, Lucas released his own claws, then retracted them. 1 second 2 3 Naya's head tilted to the side. And her claws slid back in. Good girl. Lucas kissed her face. Happy Naya turned to Sasha. Unable to resist, Sasha picked up their sweet baby and held her close. Her tiny heart beat so fast, her fur soft. Memories crashed into Sasha of the day she'd first held a cub in animal form. Julian had been bigger than Naya then, but just as gorgeous. Never could she have imagined that one day she'd be holding her own cub. Her eyes stung. Naya only allowed Sasha's hold for a little while before wriggling to be put down. Circling Lucas and Sasha, falling and getting up and slipping, Naya growled and purred and had a rest every so often against her parents. Sasha, one hand on Lucas's bare chest, couldn't stop watching her. Remember that day I held Julian for the first time? You mean the day you gave yourself away? Sasha smiled through her incipient tears. I wish I could have kept that boot he chewed on. You kept me. I'm a better souvenir. Lucas raised one leg so it was bent at the knee, the towel immediately falling open on either side of his muscled thigh. Her mind split in two. Stop that, she ordered the gorgeous adult panther on the floor while a gorgeous baby panther tried to bite at his arm with tiny panther teeth. I can't have you being all sexy while Naya's being all adorable. Her heart might explode permanently. He chuckled, moved over onto his front. And that towel, it just couldn't keep up. Before she could drag it back into place, the air filled with shattered light and a large black panther now sat beside her. Delighted, Naya tried to bite at Lucas's tail but she couldn't catch it because he'd swept it over. Moving in that adorable stumbling way, she tried to chase it, and Lucas swiped it back. Sasha laughed as Naya tried to catch it again. The simple game kept her amused and excited until she crawled into Sasha's lap, and fell fast asleep with the quickness of the toddler that she was. Stroking her hands through Naya's soft fur, Sasha caught light from the corner of her eye. Now you're naked. She tried to glare at her mate without looking at his body. Do you want me dead? Chuckling, Lucas moved so that he was leaning on his arm behind her, his lower body mostly out of her range of vision. I can't wait to take her for runs, to teach her the forest, show her how to climb to the eyrie. Sasha's overworked heart thumped. Oh God, she's going to be so much more mobile, while still a baby in every other way. Lucas tapped her on the nose. She's a cat. We'll also teach her the rules. Is she going to start jumping off the balcony? It was strength in motion when Lucas did it. The idea of Naya's tiny body flying through that much air had Sasha close to hyperventilating. Rubbing her back, Lucas made a reassuring purring sound in his chest. Not tomorrow or the day after. She's going to need time to build her strength. Sasha had the feeling he was easing her into Naya's inevitable jump, and she was okay with that. Any woman would need to be petted and reassured when her baby was about to start flying off a balcony. She's so beautiful as a cat, too. Of course she is. Lucas nuzzled her. She's your daughter. Ours. Ours. Fingers weaving into her unbound hair, Lucas kissed her with a smile on his lips while their daughter slept in her lap. Sometime during the kiss, Naya shifted spontaneously back into human form, and the dinner burned. Neither Lucas nor Sasha cared. Not with their child snoring sweetly in her dreams. Chapter 9. The architect, the one who'd put together the consortium, the one who'd had the foresight to see the fall of silence on the horizon and to understand the power vacuum it would leave in the world, considered the latest data on the Trinity Accord. If successful, Trinity and the ensuing United Earth Federation would kill the consortium, though right now, the Accord appeared to be barely treading water. Still, the architect took nothing for granted. The consortium had made the decision to go under to regroup after a member in the uppermost echelon of its membership was captured by the Arrow Squad, but that didn't mean they couldn't action small-scale disruptions. The Human Alliance, for example, would have little patience for Trinity business if anti-human insurgents started making trouble in their territory. As it happened, the architect knew of one such group. All it needed was a nudge to the right location, and a catalyst to light its destructive fuse. It was a small thing, but all chaos had to begin somewhere. As for the much bigger operation that had been put into motion by another one of the core members of the consortium, the architect looked down at the brief on Nadia Hunter. It was pitifully empty, but then the child wasn't even a year old according to consortium sources. Her importance as a symbol, however, was starting to grow as the Psi race came out of its post-silent stupor and began to look around. The architect's fellow consortium member was right. Killing the child in the right way held the potential to incite a bloody war between Psi and Changeling, humans caught in the crossfire. It would be a decisive blow that permanently shattered Trinity, and any hope of a peace that promised to severely frustrate the consortium's plans. However, a single mistake and the fury of DarkRiver and its powerful allies would focus solely on the consortium. The architect knew predatory changelings well enough to understand they wouldn't stop until each and every member of the consortium was dead. The pros and cons of the Nadia Hunter gambit required further thought, but all the pieces were in place, if and when the architect decided it was time to press go. Chapter 10. Lucas put Noe into her crib and raised the bars of the safety barrier, which he'd had to extend to their full height after she started escaping. It was to keep her safe. Lucas and Sasha would normally wake at the smallest sound, but just in case. Covering her with a furry green blanket Tamsin had knitted for her, he tucked the damn wolf snuggle toy beside her, then touched her soft, dark hair and looked at the woman who stood by his side. We did good. Sasha slipped her arm through his. Eyes of cardinal starlight touched with sparks of color on Naya. Yes, and had fun doing it. A sudden frown. She had chocolate-sprinkled milk, and I didn't clean her teeth. She usually doesn't fall asleep so early. She didn't even have her dinner. She'll wake if she's hungry, and one night without brushing her teeth won't hurt her, Lucas reassured his mate. I did that every so often myself as a kid. It's amazing how much candy I got into. Thanks for the warning. Now go put on some jeans. Chuckling, he drew her out of the nursery he and packmates had added on soon after Naya's birth. It was attached to their bedroom, so even if Naya escaped her crib, she'd have to go past their bed to get out. Anything salvageable? He asked after pulling on jeans and following Sasha to the kitchen. I think the potatoes might still be good. Super melted cheese is still melted cheese. Lucas took the pan to the table. Chicken. Lump of charcoal. Sasha looked morosely at it before shaking off her disappointment. Want omelets instead? Yep. The two of them worked side by side to prepare the omelets. Hear anything about Nikita? The recent assassination attempt on Sasha's mother had caused significant injuries. Sophie says she's pushing herself too hard. Sasha's tone tensed. She's concerned about a setback. Running a hand over her hair, Lucas pointed out an irrefutable truth. Nikita isn't used to giving up control, even for short periods. The former counselor and current member of the ruling coalition of the Psi race was a pitiless operator who was used to power. Sasha nodded, took a deep breath. So far she's fine. Sophie's going to keep me updated on her progress. Unspoken were the words that today, Sasha had to focus on her vulnerable child, not on a mother adept at lethal defense and offense. They sat down to eat less than 10 minutes later, their chairs beside each other instead of on either side of the table. Lucas liked to be able to affectionately touch his mate, and Sasha had picked up the feline habit, petting him every so often as they ate. Skin privileges between a mated pair. Simple. Deeply needed. He felt the worry that rose to the forefront of her mind now that Naya was asleep, but they both spoke only in touches until after they'd polished off the meal and she was cutting up some fruit for them to eat for dessert. That was when Sasha asked him to go over the full details of what Aiden's people had heard in the net. Her face grew white under the dark honey of her skin as he spoke. Is it a group like Pure Psi? No current signs that it's anything that focused. Lucas forced himself to be calm. His mate needed that from him right now. I'd still like to increase security precautions around her regardless. People, and not just Psi, are curious about her. Dorian had done some research for him today, discovered that the only living child of mixed Psi and changeling blood was of far more interest to various groups across the world than the pack had ever realized. The majority of those groups had little to no information about Naya, knew only that she existed. But Lucas wasn't about to take chances with the life of his cub. That curiosity is only going to grow and, his jaw tightened. Some bastards will see her only as a political pawn to exploit. Sasha nodded jerkily, but her words surprised him. Nothing that stifles her, Lucas. Her eyes had bled to pure obsidian when he first began to speak, and now they gleamed with midnight blue lowlights as she fought her emotions. He didn't know if all cardinal eyes did that, or if it was limited to the empaths, but the effect was hauntingly beautiful. Panther and man, Lucas loved Sasha's eyes in every one of her moods. Nothing that cages her, she reiterated. I promise. He knew Sasha was thinking of her own childhood, of how her abilities had been crushed and stuffed into a box. The physical security around her won't change much at all. He called a meeting of his sentinels that afternoon, with those not in the city attending via the comm, asked their opinion on the most efficient way to protect the pack's cubs without harming their wild spirits. We're going to embed more warning sensors in and around our territory, he told Sasha. That'll have an impact without affecting Naya's independence, or that of any other cub in DarkRiver. In Naya's case, the danger level had risen the instant she began to shift and became more mobile. I've also asked Dorian and Emmett to liaise with our mechanics and make sure all the pack vehicles are as secure and as tough as they can be, And we're going to quietly up the security presence anywhere our children congregate. If they can't get Naya, they might try for another cub, Sasha whispered in realization. Because of us and what we represent, because of the power DarkRiver has in Trinity. But though white lines bracketed her mouth, she didn't panic. We need to let all our friends know. Not just the rats in Snowdancer. The more eyes looking out and ears that are listening, the better our chances of catching any attempt before it goes far. DarkRiver had long thrived in isolation like the majority of changeling packs, but that time had passed. First had come the wolves, then friendships that slowly connected them to Psi humans, more changelings. The Falcons have permission to overfly our territory, and might spot suspicious movements. Lucas frowned in thought, rubbing his thumb over the side of his mate's neck as he cradled her nape. Who else? Together, the two of them made up a list and decided which one of them would talk to which party. He knew it was possible they were both overreacting, but that was significantly better than taking no action when innocent lives were on the line. Sasha made him coffee afterward, herself a hot chocolate. It was her comfort drink of choice, but what soothed her most was to go into the nursery and look in on Naya. Lucas went with her. His own panther needing to see their cub safe and snug and curled up happily in her crib. Damn it, he muttered. She's hugging that stupid wolf to her chest. Sasha's shoulders shook, the stars returning to her eyes. Baring his teeth at her, he pretended to pounce. She jumped, then ran out of the room. His panther immediately sat up in interest and the chase was on. Catching her in the next room, he threw her gently on the bed before coming down over her. Mine, he said, his lower body pressed to hers. The smug statement was of the predator he was. But this predator loved the woman he held captive, would never harm her. Stroking her fingers through his hair, Sasha said, Something else happened, didn't it? He dropped his head for a minute, allowed her to pet him. Then, as they lay tangled, he told her about the letter the boys had found, about the imprisoned, tortured water changeling. His hands fisted against the textured white sheets on their bed. This is the first new piece of information we've had on Black Sea's vanished members since the capture of the human CEO. And it's a call for help from a woman who's probably already dead. Sasha shook her head. There's always hope. No one thought Brenna would make it, and look at her now. Lucas nodded. It was a good reminder. The Snowdancer had been psychically and mentally broken when rescued. Yet instead of drowning in the darkness that had threatened to suck her under, Brenna had said, "Fuck you," to the monster who'd hurt her, and she'd chosen to live. She'd not only wrenched back control of her own life, she'd taken on an arrow and claimed him as her mate. Lucas had a great deal of respect for Riley's younger sister. None of us will give up on Layla, he promised. Unless and until we have a body, we act as if she's alive. A woman who'd fought so hard even when alone, far from the sea that was her home, deserved nothing less. It would help if Miena would allow wider dissemination of the information, but she's caught between a rock and a hard place. Sasha's eyebrows drew together, even as she continued to run her fingers through his hair. There's no way to weed out the consortium spies in Trinity, is there? Nipping at her lower lip just because he could, Lucas said. Can empaths sense deception? Possibly. Sasha nipped back, making him grin. But even if the empathic collective suddenly abandoned its code of ethics and started scanning everyone, the most dangerous spies will have dense shields. An E might pick up surface emotions, but everything else will be locked down. Running his hand down her side, Lucas pushed up her lightweight top to touch skin, purring deep in his chest at the contact. At the lush feel of her warmth against his rougher skin. Shivering, Sasha wrapped her legs around him. Why did you ask anyway? She murmured, her breath kissing his. You know no empath would ever be so dishonorable. Scans are only allowed with permission, like in business negotiations where both sides have an E at the table. Eyes going panther as his feline nature rose to the surface of his mind, Lucas took his time kissing his mate, licking his tongue over hers as he lazily explored her body. Because, he murmured against her lips several minutes later, your own research has shown that not all ES are good. The vast majority, yes, but like any being on the planet, even an E had loyalties. What if the consortium has an E in its ranks? What if that E truly believes that racial peace and the resulting commingling is bad for the Psi race? Sasha blinked, then pushed at his chest until he rolled over onto his back on the bed. Kneeling beside him, her knees brushing his side as he slid his hand under the back of her top to find skin again, she stared down at him. You're right, she whispered. Good and bad are relative terms. An E who, for whatever reason, is virulently anti-human or anti-changeling or simply pro the purity of the Psi, could justify all kinds of things. She rubbed both hands over her face. I don't know what the impact would be on the E, if the harm they did would rebound back on them, or if they'd be protected by their own belief. Lines formed on her forehead. We still don't know enough about the E designation, not after the Council spent 100 years erasing all evidence of our existence. Alice's memory still scattershot? He asked, referring to the brilliant researcher who'd spent a century in forced cryonic suspension, and who now lived among the snow dancers. Sasha nodded, her frustration a palpable thing. She has so much critical knowledge, but it's locked deep inside her. Compassion thickened her voice. I'm guessing it's a combination of lingering shock, and the organic damage done by the amount of time she spent suspended that's behind the gaps in her memory. She's tough to have come as far as she has. Lucas couldn't imagine going to sleep one day only to wake in a distant future where Sasha was dead. Naya was dead. His closest friends were all dead. I think I'd go mad. She's stronger than she knows. Sasha's eyes were dark with poignant emotion, but her heart's broken, shattered into splinters. Shaking her head, she touched her fingers to the hunter marks on his face. It hurts me to even imagine the depth of her loss. Taking her hand with his free one, he pressed a kiss to it. He didn't have to say what they both knew. If one of them died while Naya was young, the other one would fight and survive no matter their own shattered heart. What if an E decided to hide his or her ability? He asked, taking them back to a less emotive topic. That person could be a brilliant spy, Sasha said slowly. He or she could damage Trinity from the inside by doing things as simple as encouraging dissent or quietly upping people's levels of aggression. Your designation is far more dangerous than anyone realizes. Sasha's expression held a sudden taut sadness. Sometimes I wish I hadn't figured out the other side of my ability, she whispered, swallowing hard. But today, when you told me what some nasty people are saying about Naya, I knew I'd use the dark side without hesitation to protect her, regardless of any resulting psychic backlash. Lucas nudged her over to straddle him, then he tugged her down so he could pet her, kiss her. He'd been there the day she'd worked out the brutal flip side to her ability to heal minds, had felt her terrible sorrow. Nothing is ever black and white, kitten, he reminded her, allowing his claws to slice out to touch her skin. I can use my claws to protect, but I can use the same claws to rip out an enemy's throat. A slow nod from his mate, though her expression remained troubled. Trinity brings with it the potential for a dazzling future. But we have to accept that it also provides a forum for those who want to seed chaos and destruction. Right now, Lucas admitted, the consortium is beating Trinity in the cooperation stakes. Driven by self-interest, the members of the enemy group were willing to work together against everyone else. Those who'd signed the Trinity Accord, on the other hand, were becoming lost in the rivalries that had divided the world for so long. Psi against Changeling, human against Psi, big businesses against small, the list was endless. The United Earth Federation is a distant dream, isn't it? Sasha's eyes had once more lost their starlight. At least the dream now exists. By the time Naya grew up, maybe the UEF would be a functioning entity. Who knows? Sasha murmured. It could be our cub who one day leads that federation. Her spine grew stiff under his caressing hand. Aware exactly where her mind had gone, Lucas gripped her jaw, held her gaze. We'll keep Naya safe. It was a growling promise. Yes. Sasha's tone was resolute. We will. Releasing her jaw to run her gorgeously badly behaving hair through his fingers, he tugged lightly on the thick curls, released them, fascinated by the texture and by the way the strands clung to his skin. You are such a cat. It was a husky statement. He leaned up on his elbows to flick his tongue over her lips, teasing her into a kiss that ended up with her pinned under him, tall and curvy in all the right places. Setting aside politics and the outside world, he played with the woman who'd begun the wave of change with her very public defection, this empath with her gentle heart and her wild courage. The scent of her arousal made his cock throb. Lucas. A demanding touch on the back of his neck as Sasha locked her legs around his hips once again, her mouth moving to his throat. Yes, his mate knew exactly how he liked to be touched. Just as he knew her every sensual weakness. Pressing her more heavily into the bed, he slid one hand under her top to cup the lush heaviness of her breast. His panther growled in his chest, full of primal pride that she was his. A tiny answering growl sounded from the nursery. Breaking the kiss, they both turned to look that way. The growl came again. Sasha's body began to shake as her face filled with laughter. Someone is not sleeping. They waited in hopeful quiet. 5 seconds later, just as Lucas was bending his mouth to Sasha's once more, Naya made an adorable sound that might have been her attempt at a grown panther's more guttural vocalization. It held impatience and excitement in zero drowsiness. Dropping his head forward, Lucas nipped at Sasha's collarbone. Why did we think having a cub was a good idea? Sasha laughed again. She's probably hungry. Even if she isn't, I don't think we should be strict about bedtime. Not today. No, Lucas agreed with a nuzzle of his nose against hers. Not today. Today their baby needed a little extra care and attention. Getting up, the two of them went into the nursery to discover a small black panther trying to shove her head through the bars of her crib. Shaking his head when Naya froze and gave him a look of wide-eyed innocence, Lucas picked up their child and held her black-furred body against his bare chest. His growl was echoed by an excited one from her. Lucas nipped her on the nose, the affectionate act of a panther with his misbehaving cub. Want some food, princess? Butting her head against his chin, Naya made sounds of impatience. I get it. You want to go for a run in the forest first. He knew Naya couldn't really run. She could barely walk without falling over. But tonight she wanted to be a panther. Naya scrabbled at him at the pronouncement, her claws making fine furrows on his skin. He didn't correct her this time. Predatory changeling parents had to tread a careful line between teaching their children not to use claws against their playmates, and to use them ferociously if defending against an enemy. In his current protective mood, Lucas decided his cub should learn the ferocious part first. Her older playmates would teach her the rules of play soon enough. Putting her on the floor, he pulled off his jeans, to his mate's sigh and his grin, and shifted. Then before Naya could escape, he used his teeth to grip her by the ruff of her neck. Her tiny body went instinctively limp in his hold as he padded to the front door. Sasha had already unlocked it, so he went straight out onto the balcony that had a railing only along one side. Glancing back to see his mate had squeezed her eyes tightly shut, he huffed in laughter and jumped off. He landed on the forest floor with the grace of the cat he was, his cub safe. Putting Naya down, he looked up and growled at Sasha to let her know they were unharmed. She peeked over the edge, one hand on her heart and her hair tumbling around her face. I'm coming down, she said in a breathless voice. Don't go too far. He and Naya had barely gone 3 feet before Sasha scrambled down the rope ladder to join them. All wobbly limbs and wild curiosity, Naya was distracted by 1,000 things at once. He watched her with a father's patience, giving her praise when she did something clever, helping her get upright when she fell. The night was cool and calm around their small family, the stars overhead a glittering quilt, and when Sasha came to her knees beside him, her hand on his back as they watched Naya try to chase fireflies, his heart felt too huge to stay inside his chest. For this woman, for this child, for his pack, he'd do anything. Trinity would not defeat him. Neither would the consortium. Chapter 11. Caleb was unsurprised when late that night Ivy Jane Zen requested he show her the dangerously subtle new damage in the signet. The president of the empathic collective had proven to have a steel will beneath her soft exterior. He was surprised that she turned up on the net without an arrow escort. Where's Vasich? The teleporter was Ivy's husband and second in command of the squad. Ivy answered his unspoken question instead of the one he'd asked. I'm an empath, Caleb. I know exactly how much you love Sahara. And Sahara called the ES her friends. Thus, Caleb would never touch a hair on their heads unless they turned into a threat to the woman who was his heart. Then, of course, he would annihilate them to bloody pieces. Caleb didn't enjoy being so transparent. The twisted darkness in him reared up in an aggressive stance, too long used to fighting the enemy to ever trust easily. Breaching shields, Madam President? Laughter in Ivy's reply. No need. I've seen you two together, remember? You look at her like she's a rare, beautiful gift. Her mental voice grew softer. To cherish, to protect. I know, because I see the same in Vasich's eyes when he looks at me. In the physical world, standing on the deck of his home, Caleb raised an eyebrow. Does Vasich know you're here alone? Does Sahara know she's made it to an overprotective Neanderthal? Caleb's lips curved. Ivy's sharp response was so close to what Sahara might have said in similar circumstances. You're ready? Heavy shields. He might not appreciate the way certain ES were so good at seeing through a man's skin, but he'd permit no harm to come to them. Without the ES, the net was dead and Sahara needed the net to breathe, to live. Yes. Meet me at these Psi-net coordinates. He was already in that dark, diseased location devoid of other Psi minds, his shield so effective that he had to alert Ivy to his presence before she could spot him. Her own psychic presence held sparks of color unseen in any minds except for those of designation E. Caleb had experienced the harsh viciousness of silence firsthand, but even he had difficulty imagining the brutal extent of the conditioning each E must have undergone to have been so completely smothered. To Caleb, the fact that the ES had survived at all proved a mental resilience unseen in any other designation in the net. Have you considered working for a corporate? He asked Ivy as she moved to examine the dead and disintegrating section. Why? Looking for a new hire. Caleb already had 2 ES on his staff. As such, he was far ahead of the curve. The ES were so stretched that even those more suited for corporate work were being asked to take up heavy lifting in the honeycomb. Asked, not commanded. That was the difference between the Empathic Collective and many of the other organizations in the Signet. It was as well they had the backing of the Arrow Squad, or no one would take their requests to non-empaths seriously. 100 years of silence had taught the Psi that only the ruthless and the cold-blooded survived. Caleb had believed the same until he found Sahara again. The woman for whom he'd extinguished the world, except that she'd asked him to save it, hadn't lost herself in spite of the horror she'd survived. She'd come out of it with her soul and her spirit intact, was still the same generous Sahara who'd first extended the hand of friendship toward a boy who knew only pain and isolation. If there was a ruthless bone in her body, he hadn't found it yet. Then had come the empaths. Caleb had seen those empathic sparks of color, begun to comprehend the mental strength it must have taken for an E not to break despite being in a psychic stranglehold for decades. He knew what it was to be leashed, to have that leash pulled until he couldn't breathe. Those who underestimated the ES would one day get a very nasty surprise. I thought you might have become sick of politics by now, he said to Ivy. I can offer a pay package that'll take you immediately into the top percentile of earners in the world, and you'd be working in a far less stressful environment. You're very good, she said with open amusement, but I've settled into my position in the collective. Despite his offer, Caleb had thought as much. Ivy Jane Zen had started out unsure if she could lead, but these days she was a force to be reckoned with. The offer is open to any high-gradient E who wants a more regular 9-to-5 job. While the honeycomb needed every E in the net, it had become clear that not all ES could bear the pressure. Those ES remained useful in other capacities, including in specialized medical professions, and to corporates who wanted an edge on their competitors during negotiations. Empathic ethics might not allow for active scans without the permission of the individual being scanned, but as changelings picked up sense without trying, ES picked up the emotional undercurrents in any given situation. Even in passive mode, they tilted the scales to their employer's advantage. Ivy was quiet for a long time as she focused on the problematic section of the net, but when she spoke, her answer was unexpected. I'll keep that in mind. I wouldn't recommend jobs at most of the corporates to my people, but you. Yes. As if guessing his surprise, she said. Because of Sahara. She'd never let you mistreat an E. Again, Caleb wasn't certain he liked being in any way predictable. Sahara, he telepathed to the woman who had held his heart in her hands from the day they met. Please refrain from making me appear nice or trustworthy, especially to those of designation E. Sahara's laughter was light in the darkness, a brightness that encompassed the most twisted corners of his soul. No chance of that. Underneath the glittering night sky on the outskirts of Moscow, she came out of the house to wrap her arms around him from behind. The ES know exactly how dangerous you are, but they also know you and your abilities are on their side. I'm only on one side. He closed one of his hands over hers. Yours. Look after my friends, won't you, Caleb? Stop making so many. I love you too. His lips curved slightly as he returned his attention to the Signet, and Sahara went back into the house, after a kiss to his back that made his battered soul curl up in pleasure. What do you see? He asked Ivy. The fraying is new, but the disease itself isn't as bad as it was pre-honeycomb, she murmured. Back then, the Signet was literally rotting away piece by piece, as if with gangrene. Caleb waited. The honeycomb isn't visible here, Ivy continued after a small pause, but it is present to my empathic senses. That fine net of emotional strands is all that's keeping this section from collapsing. She indicated the lifeless blackness in front of them. But Caleb might not be an E, but he'd spent a lifetime learning to read people. First so he could predict the moves of the psychopath who'd ruled his childhood, later because he'd realized that to know people was to know their secrets. And secrets meant power. The disintegration below the surface? Ivy said. It's eroding the foundation on which the honeycomb sits, and with each frayed thread, the weight of the dead section gets heavier. Thin as they are here, the honeycomb bonds could simply snap, and if they do... Caleb scanned the area. The rotten section was unpopulated, but there were mines anchored within touching distance of the black. Should it collapse, it would take hundreds, perhaps thousands of those mines with it, much like a whirlpool sucking in everything around it. Do you want me to move those mines? Caleb couldn't do it himself, but the net mine could make certain adjustments. No, Ivy's voice held an awareness of the risk of her decision, of the lives that hung in the balance. If they go, they take their part of the honeycomb with them. There'd effectively no longer be anything holding this section of the net in place. It might create a tear so massive it could cause a catastrophic chain reaction, snuffing out the very minds they wanted to save. I'll set part of my consciousness to monitoring this area. It was a task Caleb would have normally given the net mind, but he was starting to have the disturbing suspicion that as the net frayed, so did the neo-sentients in charge of it. The signs had been there for a long time if he thought about it. Lapses in concentration, lost or missing pieces of data. A distinct lack of growth since Caleb was a child. Yes, the neo-sentients grew at a glacial pace in comparison to a psi mind, but it had shown no development in over 2 decades. In point of fact, it appeared to have gone backward to an even more childlike state. The only reason Caleb hadn't noticed earlier was because he'd been distracted by the violent potential of the dark mind. Though he'd never differentiated between his acceptance of the twin neo-sentients, handling the dark mind had always required more attention. Inadvertently hiding the subtle degeneration of its twin, Caleb considered sharing that suspicion with Ivy, made the decision that the ES were already at overload. One more worry could be the proverbial straw that caused a fatal breakdown. It'll alert you if the risk of total net failure at this location hits 75%. At which point, the risk in not moving the mines would outweigh the danger of a possible collapse and chain reaction. Ivy's attention lingered on him. Can you maintain such long-term monitoring without risk to yourself? Empaths. Dangerous to themselves most of all with their concern for others. Yes, he said at the same instant that thought passed through his head. As a dual cardinal, the only one in the net, Caleb had off-the-scale psychic abilities his mind had learned to utilize without melting down in the process. A single monitoring program wouldn't even register as usage on his internal psychic meter. Not when he could cause a cataclysmic earthquake without coming close to burning out. Caleb looked at the dead section again. That's all you see? Broken threads, she murmured. Frayed edges. Like a piece of natural fabric coming apart, thread by thread. If it was the absence of active empaths that caused the damage, the disintegration makes no sense. Not with so many ES awake now. Caleb could see sparks of color heading into the rot, to be absorbed by it. It's like something is acting against us and it's stronger. Ivy made a sound of frustration before her mental presence froze in place. The net mind, I felt it. So had Caleb, and this time the neo-sentients had passed on an image that was impossible to misinterpret. A honeycomb structure, but with approximately every third hexagon missing, he said for Ivy Jane's benefit, not certain the net mind had spoken to them both. We're missing a vital component, Ivy whispered. Without it, the net will never be whole. A pause. Another lost designation? Caleb shook his head on the physical plane.
Impossible.
I have access to top-secret data from prior to the dawn of silence. No other designation was buried like the ES were buried. When I ask the netmind for clarification, all I get is a cascade of emotion, loss, pain, brokenness. Tears filled Ivy's psychic voice. It's in so much pain, Caleb. So is the dark mind. Caleb thought of the time right after the awakening of the ES and the creation of the honeycomb. The netmind had been a wonder of hope, joyous laughter in his mind. They've lost hope, he found himself saying, though he was no expert in emotion. Ivy's response was thick with sorrow. Yes, you're right. The netmind held on for so long. Hid the ES, protected us, but now it's realized we can't stop the pain. Not totally. And without the netmind, the dark mind couldn't exist. Opening his senses, Caleb reached for the twin neo-sentients, asked what was missing, what they needed. The emotions that came back were of a staggering loss. Image after image of a body with organs torn out by uncaring hands, leaving the patient bloody and barely alive. When? Caleb asked, using a visual of a calendar and a clock with 24 numbers on it. The pages of the calendar began to flip back at inhuman speed as the hands of the clock spun backward, around and around and around. It all came to a stop at 1 minute past midnight in the year 1979. The dawn of